Hello, my name's Robert, and welcome to my presentation on what I've learnt being a member of the Visualising Peace VIP team over Martinmas semester 2023. I'd first off like to start talking about my entries to our virtual Museum of Peace. They focused on observation as a tool for peace, neutrality and principled impartiality, how they're perceived by, how they're done by, how they're thought of as by EAPI, which is the Ecumenical Accompanying Programme in Palestine and Israel, and the Red Cross later on. To start off with, EAPI is a program that's run by the World Council of Churches, which places around 30 human rights monitors in Palestine, mostly the West Bank, over the course of a 3-month stint. They aim to provide a 24/7 monitoring presence. Sometimes they call it a protective presence to deter human rights violations due to them being an international team who records any that will happen and will send them to various NGOs, UN agencies, and other kind of refugee organisations. They do not intervene when human rights violations are seen to take place, but just by their very protective presence, they are widely appreciated when crossing checkpoints by Palestinians. Some have found their specific focus on Israel contentious, but they respond that they are only there in Palestine because they've been invited by the heads of churches in Jerusalem. They embody the model of accompaniment at local request due to the Christian history that's deeply rooted in Jerusalem and the West Bank, rather than anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic reasons. And after returning home, this observation is used for their advocacy, which they perceive as being a really central part of what they call accompaniment, walking with Palestinians. Rather than neutrality, EAPI focuses on principled impartiality as one of their fundamental principles. For them, this means that they uphold human rights, international humanitarian law, and in general international law, no matter who's violating them. They're aiming for a just peace rather than advocating on either side of the conflict, which is part of why they have such a stress on advocacy. So as opposed to the Red Cross and its greater stress on confidentiality as part of their neutrality, because they're really focused on maintaining access, EAPI is a lobbying program as well, which aims to, with their observation, as discussed before, focus on bringing to light human rights violations to encourage them to not happen again. This is, of course, a balancing act, so they can neither operate in a political vacuum, because otherwise they can't do their important advocacy work, but they also need to, not that these are mutually exclusive, but they need to also bear in mind a commitment to a just peace for all Palestinians and Israelis. So that's why they have P and I in their title, because even though they don't operate in Israel, they still believe that Israelis are harmed by, as well as Palestinians, by there not being a just peace. For this, they find that mostly they advocate back home, but on the ground in terms of intervention, non-violence and collaboration with both Palestinian and Israeli human rights groups are really foundational for them. The Red Cross's approach to their impartiality is distinct from EAPI's. They instead focus, rather than on principled impartiality, on neutrality. This is one of the most fundamental principles. It's on their second rank of their pyramid, just below impartiality and humanity. So for that, it's a means and an end to that. So it's important to not care which side someone's fighting on to be able to give them help, but it's also crucial to be trusted by all sides so that they can have access to assign aid based on impartiality and humanity. So just on need alone, rather than nation, religion, race, gender, anything like that. For this, they perceive confidentiality as absolutely crucial, because a lot of the work that they're doing is very sensitive, for example, location-based. If they're visiting a prisoner, they don't want the other side to know where they're keeping the prisoners of war. So for that, they have to trust the Red Cross absolutely. This means, though, that the threat of publicity about publicising human rights violation is actually very credible from the Red Cross, because they have such a solid reputation for confidentiality from their long history. It's a balancing act to maintain access and also pile the pressure on so that hostage takers or prison guards will ameliorate their conditions that they're keeping these prisoners in. Sometimes, though, this can be seen as siding with the oppressor because they're not publicly condemning a side. For example, in Abu Ghraib, they did not publicise what that they witnessed as American human rights violations, nor in Ukraine. They, after meeting with Lavrov, in fact, the Russian foreign minister, their office in Kiev was hit by a Molotov cocktail. The Red Cross responds that while they don't avoid controversy such as that, their neutrality avoids a total breakdown of trust, so they're always able to maintain some basic level of access. So now we're moving on to my entries to the Visualising Peace library. So my very first one has the catchy title of Dining with Diplomats, Praying with Gunmen. So it's an account by Anne Bennett, who was a Quaker peace worker in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and it explores particularly British Quaker peacemaking efforts as they went to variously Northern Ireland, Nigeria during the civil war there, and all around the world as part of their kind of grassroots peace building. So because they have a religious emphasis on non-violence and pacifism, they build on that and combine it with deep local connection and long-term commitment. So because they are voluntary work funded by not in individual projects, but over a long stint of time by a religious body, they're able to go to a conflict area for a decade and really try and mend relationships, mend communities, and it's very interesting in how it stresses the importance of that. They aim to expand the capacity of local peacemakers, so they only take roles which they can't do. For example, if a peacemaker is of a race or religion where they can't safely travel to another area, then they're able to facilitate shuttle diplomacy for them. This is in contrast to other also very important Quaker peace building work, which is top-down discussions. So there are networks of Quaker houses, for example, in Geneva, Brussels, New York, as well as the Quaker United Nations office and the Quaker Council for European Affairs. These all offer quiet, off-the-record opportunities for diplomats to meet where they're not going to be lampooned by the press for betraying their country or talking to the other side, but they'll be able to sit down and actually get to the meat of any issues. My second entry was an episode of the PAX Palestine podcast. So PAX is a Dutch peace organisation which sends ecumenical accompaniers to Palestine and Israel. This episode interviewed two volunteers and asked about their experience while they're in Palestine, and they talked a lot about settler attacks and harassment, and specifically the impact on school children. So one of the programs of IAPI is that they will accompany children through checkpoints and through settler communities to go to their primary schools and secondary schools. They found it quite emotional and frustrating, discussing how they were not able to intervene. They're just able to watch. But then this is balanced against being able to raise public awareness of this with their eyewitness accounts when they go back home, and subsequently political and diplomatic pressure, hopefully, from their local governments. My third entry is a book by Judith Butler called The Force of Nonviolence, and it's subtitled An Ethico-Political Bind. So this is actually a philosophy theoretical book exploring nonviolence rather than being personal and spiritual it's crucial for affirming social equality. So it's a principled, kind of very necessary political tool for her egalitarian mission. Lives are valued for Butler by their grievability. So this is actually to do with a societal measure of a life's worth. So when we see for example, an English life that's sensationalized in the media when they died, versus just a number about a foreign war, that has massive implications for how we perceive violence, how we perceive non-violence, and the worth of others. So since Butler is trying to move towards social equality, she's saying that we should really raise up the grievability of others. Butler really stresses interdependence and collaboration. So instead of some being on an island, Robinson Crusoe style of autonomy, she is very keen on increasing our interdependence, so it raises the cost of violence so that discourages us from doing it. So instead of autarky, being vulnerable to the other is really key for our exercise of non-violence. And my fourth entry is another quite theoretical one. So this is a paper by Antonino Drago, which explores Johann Galtung's ABC model, which is a model of conflict where unresolved tension between attitudes, behaviours, and he uses internal in front of, but contradictions are what causes violent conflict. And in this paper, Drago argues that it can be applied to psychoanalysis, so specifically Freud's theories of mental conflict. So similar to international conflict, Drago thinks that attitudes, behaviours become shared. So people have to adopt the others. He adopts a very theoretical, psychological view, but Galtung has other writing on how this applies to international diplomacy, and interestingly talks about the contradictions becoming merged, one and the same between them. So they both end up sharing the same interests and the same vulnerabilities, and this is a route out of conflict. So what I found particularly interesting about this paper was, so he's actually a physicist by trade, and it's his stress on non-classical logic as being crucial for this. So rather than defeating the other, he's very big on these triads. They do not compare kind of the three individual relations between the triad, but it can only be understood holistically as a whole that contains more and the true state of the conflict rather than individual relations between two parties. So like Galtung says, is arguing that we must transcend conflict rather than defeating the other violently. And my final entry to the Peace Library, it was a recorded lecture given by Johann Galtung to the University of San Diego. He basically explores his very basic thoughts and theories about reconciliation and positive peace. So part of that was the ABC model, as I've mentioned beforehand. And he just gives a very interesting account of his experience in mediation, peace building. So, for example, his tips that one must avoid one-on-one contact between fighters. So instead of saying, oh, we need to get everyone around a table, instead you need to use a skilled mediator and ask them to go and talk to everyone one-on-one, confidentially, privately, and try and figure out the legitimate goals. And that is what we have to judge when we're trying to bring conflict to an end. So his peace formula, which is equity or equality times by harmony divided by trauma times by conflict, is part of this. So bringing legitimate goals together, specifically by the use of questions. So he's very fond of the phrasing such as what is the Afghanistan where you would like to live in, which is, I think, really fascinating. So he also compares Afghanistan to Switzerland, and he argues that they require similar, very federalized, decentralized approaches to polity so that they can have a lasting peace there, which is quite thought-provoking. For my public engagement work, I explored how people visualize everyday peace through photography. So I asked a purposefully diverse group of my friends to send me photos from their camera roll that look like peace to them. And I did my own kind of quantitative analysis on this, so looking at how many photos have animals, how many are light, how many are dark, how many have a person in, what about landscapes, plants, waters, all of these things. And then went and discussed this with the rest of the VIP team. And I created this collage out of all of these photos, trying to loosely group the images by color, composition, and content. So putting the animals together and putting people and food and drink in one corner. And I found the most interesting part of it talking to people about why they submitted their photos. They all said that they had very deep personal significance, but they were often quite dismissive of their own contributions, saying that they were generic landscapes or in other ways kind of boring, which is an interesting contribution to thinking about how people visualize peace. So some of my thoughts on where the VIP could go through from here include visualizing everyday peace, maybe in ways like collages, but generally being far more systematic about it. So I didn't necessarily ask all the same question to everyone. I did in my initial prompt, but after that had varied, very interesting discussions, but might not be the most scientific approach. And I think that might have an opportunity for slightly more rigorous analysis. I think that as my interest with EAPI and other Quaker peace building focus on religious but pragmatic elements of peacemaking and peace building would be really, really interesting. I didn't explore these other things, but I think that local peacemakers, and a stress on that, and non-institutionalized and non-group violence, for example, some interpersonal knife crime, looking at efforts involved to reduce that would be very, very interesting, as well as kind of deeper, more abstract analysis of why people think that war is exciting and peace is boring, or why many people think that other people think that. So when we see media, that it's often aimed towards war movies rather than peace movies, for example. Why is the market for that bigger? And also, I think that we did as part of our VIP, some people wrote autoethnographies, so discussing how they visualize peace as part of our useful fiction. And I think it would be very interesting to get the VIP team members to to write how they visualize peace at the start and at the end, and see where their learning has taken them through that. So finally, I have a few takeaways of what I have learned from the VIP project. So I've really come to dwell on the importance of not rushing to conclusions or condemnations. So my work on neutrality and principled impartiality have really shown me how being able to talk to the other side, no matter what, is really important for engaging with them and future peace, and that truth is the first casualty of war. So this idea that especially with mass media, we really quickly lose what's actually happening, especially on the ground in a lot of conflict zones, even interpersonally, not just internationally. Also, through doing my collage, I've really found that creativity is very important to kind of holistic visualization and finding out how a wider group visualizes peace. It's the creative process is very important for drawing links between small individual visualizations, and I found that very powerful in my research. And finally, religion's place in peacemaking. So through my work in EAPI and Quaker peace building, I found it really interesting how religion is super essential to most people around the world's lives, and yet it's still ignored if it's not what is causing a conflict. It's quite rarely viewed by top-down secular organizations as a credible solution to conflict, even though often kind of religious mediators will have long traditions and theological reasons for non-violence, which will be more understood and appreciated by actors on the ground, for example, or theological arguments for reconciliation. Yeah, thank you very much for listening to my presentation.